Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore. Community Bookstore will be celebrating 50 years in business this year, and we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. Thank you for spending the evening with us. Today, I'm delighted to be working once again with our friends at New York Review Books to welcome Michael Hoffman, Merve Emre, and Gwendolyn Riley for a conversation about Elizabeth Taylor's Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont, newly reissued from NYRB Classics. Now to some housekeeping. We've enabled Zoom's auto-transcribe setting, so if your version of Zoom is up to date, hit the live transcription button on the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, which is also on the bottom of your screen. We will be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat box through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to resolve them quickly. Our last two virtual events of 2021 are next week. Next Tuesday on December 7th, we're collaborating with Third Place Books in Seattle to welcome Sasha Stanisic and translator Damien Searles for the only US event for the novel Where You Come From, in conversation with Jennifer Croft. And on Thursday, December 9th, we're closing out the year with our friend and neighbor, Siri Hustvedt, who will be discussing her new book of essays, Mothers, Fathers, and Others, with her daughter, the musician Sophie Auster. Those programs are up on our website now and taking registrations. And while this is our last NYRB Classics event for the year, you can visit our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on next year's offerings. Now a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Michael Hoffman is a German-born, British-educated poet and translator. He's the author of 2 books of essays and 5 books of poems, most recently One Lark, One Horse. Among his translations are plays by Bertolt Brecht and Patrick Süskind, the selected poems of Durs Grünbein and Gottfried Benn, and novels and stories by, among others, Franz Kafka, Peter Stamm, his father, Gert Hoffman, and 14 books by Joseph Roth. He teaches at the English department at the University of Florida. You'll all have to excuse my German pronunciation. Merve Emre is the author of the Ferrante Letters and the Personality Brokers. She's the editor of the annotated Mrs. Dalloway and is finishing a book titled Post-Discipline, Literature, Professionalism, and the Crisis of the Humanities. She's a contributing writer at The New Yorker. Her essays and criticism have appeared in the New York Review of Books, Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, the London Review of Books, and more. She's an associate professor of English at the University of Oxford. And Gwendolyn Riley is the author of First Love, which was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Literature, the Dylan Thomas Prize, the Gordon Byrne Prize, and the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. Cold Water, Sick Notes, Joshua Spassky, and Opposed Positions are her other books. In 2018, the Times Literary Supplement named her as one of the 20 best British and Irish novelists working today, and her new novel, My Phantoms, will be published by NYRB in August 2022. Michael, Merve, Gwendolyn, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thanks for being here, and I'll hand it off to you three. Michael, could you perhaps start us off with a reading from the novel?
Well, I mean, is this going to be the novel, or is this going to be the piece of introduction? I'm not.
Whatever you want. Whatever you want.
Not sure. Well, I will read this because it's the only thing that's sort of half prepared. The paragraph of my introduction about just getting on to the subject of Mrs. Palfrey or Palfrey. Kingsley Amis described Mrs. Palfrey in his New Statesman review as a novel about loneliness, old age, and approaching death. In terms of brute fact, his message is about the same as that of a standard contemporary reader's review, which sees a detailed description of old people, slow and a little depressing. That, though, comes with a steady subcutaneous drip in detailed, in old, in slow and little and depressing. Even description strikes me as disingenuous and wrong. One can hear in it the whine of mingled plaintiveness and balked self-adoration, the authentic "who needs this" huffing of our trip-advisory times, the age of Experian or the new irk. What we like is relatable, whatever that means, while what we dislike or makes us uncomfortable is depressing. What hope is there for our species if narcissism governs us even when we are reading? In Angel, her historical novel about a popular historical novelist, Taylor writes of her heroine's reading habits. She had never cared much for books because they did not seem to be about her. This, surely, is relatability in all its stupid glory, and 50 years before it was even invented. I find Amos's description to be true, candid, and economical. It even manages to sound a little zestful.
Thank you, Michael. So maybe I'll just start us off with a question about being old, because it seems that there are different ways of growing old in this novel. There are the women and the man whose bodies age, Mrs. Palfrey and the other people that are at the Claremont. But there's also the sense that the nation has grown old, or it's entered its kind of post-imperial phase. Yes. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, about the relationship you see in the novel between people aging and a nation aging out of its former glory.
Gwendolyn, me?
Whichever one of you wants, or just thoughts on aging and the novel more generally would also be fine.
Well, there's that very striking passage, isn't there, where Mrs. Palfrey talks about not being English, not feeling like being English meant anything anymore while she was abroad. Sorry for people watching. Mrs. Palfrey is an elderly lady who's come to stay at this hotel on the Cromwell Road in London, having been widowed. And her husband, Arthur, was some kind of colonial functionary. So she spent a lot of time abroad where being English meant something, and it was part of her identity. It protected her. She felt, and then suddenly, now that she's in this hotel, it doesn't mean anything anymore. And she feels very raw. And as how that sits with England today, I suppose English people thinking being English doesn't mean what it used to is behind a lot of mischief, maybe. But in the novel, Mrs. Palfrey doesn't act out. I mean, she behaves with tremendous dignity about this fact. I mean, real dignity. But that's certainly a strike. Go on.
Oh, no, I was going to say, but there are other members, there are other guests at the Claremont that do not behave with that kind of dignity, right?
Well, this is true. I mean, they take to the bottle, or they write cross letters to the Daily Telegraph, and Mr. Osmond is the fellow who's profoundly exasperated if he hears a foreign accent on the giving the weather report. Something, I mean, that people say about Elizabeth Taylor that her humor is like Jane Austen sometimes, or maybe there's a sort of Chekhovian aspect to it. In this book, maybe because we've got this community of characters who are sort of a little bit cut off from life with a capital L anyway. I think the word muffled appears about 5 times in the first 4 pages. They're really in this, their own little community. But her humor is, I mean, it's quite, she's not above a sort of, you know, some rather ripe humor, even a little bit sordid. And it struck me that there was something of a sort of carry-on film in it. I was warned by my husband, don't mention carry-on films because American viewers might not know, but these were films sort of roughly around the same time as Taylor was writing. So I guess 50s to 70s. And they were fruity comedy films with a lot of double entendres in them, but the cast, all the actors were psychically maimed alcoholics. And I think if I were to picture casting this book, I would picture Bernard Bresslaw as Mrs. Palfrey and Charles Hawtrey as Mr. Osmond, and just a very cramped, damp collection of characters, and that humor that's really rather, you know, a little bit sordid in places. In other places, it is subtle and gentle and full of compassion. So I've forgotten where I started now, but here I am.
We started with aging. And we got to write humor, which is perfectly appropriate. So, Michael. Oh, Michael, are you muted?
Yes, I mean, she was a tall woman with. Am I?
No, I can hear.
Do I need to do something?
Sorry,
Or-
I can hear you now. I can hear you now.
Yeah, is it all right? I was just saying, on the second page, the first little couple of sentences about Mrs. Palfrey. She was a tall woman with big bones and a noble face, dark eyebrows and a neatly folded jowl. She would have made a distinguished-looking man, and sometimes wearing evening dress, looked as Lord Louis Mountbatten might in drag. And there's a sort of part of the, I mean, as Gwendolyn suggests, I mean, there's almost a sort of cross-dressing aspect to the book. So all the women are men, and all the men, even Mr. Osmond with his fearsome letters, is an old woman. And that's one of the things that goes on in this aging that you asked about, that you raised. But it's also aging in a time when young people seem to have taken over, which makes them all feel doubly old and doubly left behind and sort of triply apprehensive. Where is all this going? What's going to be left of us?
Well, I was thinking about how one kind of novel that's in the background of Mrs. Palfrey is the city novel, the novel where the kind of modernist city novel where you have a protagonist who's wandering around a city, experiencing its sights and sounds and trying to account for its history. And one of the interesting things to me about this novel was how every time Mrs. Palfrey thinks about being that kind of protagonist, her varicose veins get in the way, or she slips and she falls. And it made me think about what kinds of novels or what forms of the novel are available to protagonists who are not young anymore, or who aren't even middle-aged necessarily. Gwendolyn, what you said about the sense that everything is muffled, that everything is claustrophobic, right, raises the question of how much can happen to these people, right? What will the drama of the remaining days of their lives be? And I was just wondering, I was wondering how you thought about the limitations of plot, the limitations of setting that are part of this novel, that are so important to this novel.
Well, I think if you think about how, a classic way to set up a novel is to write about a scene or a novel or a play, the scene, a routine, and then it gets disrupted. So that's exactly what she does here. It gets disrupted when Mrs. Palfrey makes a new friend with Ludo, the writer, who I'm sure we'll come to. But I wrote down a couple of quotes along those lines. One of the main excitements while the routine still holds is the menu being put up every day. And so all these oldsters go and gather around and look at the menu, even though there'll be no surprises there. So there's just a line Taylor writes, there were permutations, but no innovations. And later on, Mr. Osmond is out at a dinner of his Masonic Society, and Mrs. Palfrey, who's gone with him as a date, notices how he's treated and says he was not snubbed, but he was not encouraged. And I think that gives a sense of how hemmed in they are. So they're longing for a disruption. But what's the disruption going to be? That's frightening too, because often it's just one of them being carted off to the next place, either feet first or to the nursing home, to somewhere that won't be even quite as pleasant as the Claremont Hotel. Yeah, you're right though. They can't wander around and be flaneurs. And
so it's both that desire for some kind of drama, but also the knowledge that the most likely drama to come is death.
Yes,
right? That's a very sort of interesting. I mean, I think that's the kind of tension, that's the unease that you feel throughout this.
Well, they're all on a short leash or on short commons. I mean, yes, it is a city novel, but it's almost more a square novel. I mean, you almost think the whole thing is going around one of these these sort of rather alluring London squares, but you can never get into it because you don't have a key. And they are private, and the only thing that happens is people take their dogs walking around the outside of it, and you risk stepping in something, and that's the kind of change variation that you don't wish.
You know, just to switch gears a little bit, I mean, something that I really love about Elizabeth Taylor is how her novels are full of bad writers. So I'm thinking about how in A View of the Harbor, which everybody should also read from New York Review of Books, about how in A View of the Harbor, you have the romance novelist Beth Casaubon. How in Angel, right, you have Angel, Deverell, and how in Mrs. Palfrey, you have Ludovic Myers, who's the young man that Mrs. Palfrey meets, who decides to write a novel about Mrs. Palfrey and the guests at the Claremont Hotel. And I believe the name of the novel that he writes is called They Were Not Allowed to Die Here. Is that right?
We aren't allowed to die here.
We aren't allowed to die here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what you two make of that, this incredibly talented novelist populating her novels with other novelists that are kitschy, that are out of step with their times. They're always kind of belated, with novelists who are sort of exploiting other people in uncomfortable ways. What do you make of the novelists in her novels?
I think they're all rather treasurable characters, and I don't know if we really know that they're bad apart from Angel. I mean, there's a poet as well in A View of the Harbor, the poet Geoffrey, and I mean, Taylor writes such great set pieces, and when he goes round to give a poetry reading to Beth and she's just trying to darn her socks and tune out and think about her novel, that's very, very funny. I mean, it's writers and painters as well. There's often a painter there. The painters seem to be bad painters, maybe, but the writers with their shabby overcoats and 3-bar fires, I love reading about them. I mean, I came to Taylor through Angel, I think, which I found in some Liverpool secondhand shop when I was a teenager, and I don't know if I appreciated that she was a bad writer then. It seemed like Anne of Green Gables or something, you know, before she learned just to write about Avonlea. I quite liked her highfalutin style at that point. And I like particularly, it's very, again, a great scene where Angel, who's this teenage girl from the north, I think, goes down to meet her London publishers and is instructed how she needs to change her manuscript, and says, or I think rather crunches no to all their suggestions. So they're just a great, you know, I enjoy all of those characters. It's a fashionable thing to say you hate writers who write about writers. People say that, don't they? I love it anyway, and I like all of hers.
I think one of the things that Taylor does that's quite interesting is she takes on overtones of those writers in each of her novels without reproducing at all what we think their writing would be like. So Angel is a slightly more Baroque or a slightly more decadent novel than A View from the Harbor. And A View from the Harbor has its kind of tawdry romance, its affair plot within it. And I think you're right that with Ludo, it's actually, and Michael, this is a question I had for you, it's difficult to get a sense for whether he's a good or a bad writer, or what kind of book We Weren't Allowed to Die There is actually going to turn out to be. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about the figure of Ludo in Mrs.
I think he's on the fence. I think. I mean, he could yet make either. I mean, he has trouble writing an interesting letter to his mother, but that may make him a good writer in future. But it may also not. I think these. It's interesting that the books all have writers in them. I mean, it's almost like a little like a little, just a stripe, just something expressing sort of familiarity or part ownership or something like that. Or those convex mirrors that you have on sideboard so that people can keep an eye on the room. So she has sort of something like that in her books to see what the room is doing. You know what I mean?
No, I do. I have a particular love of convex mirrors, so I do know what you're talking about. But I also always got the sense that she, so in the short stories, right? You'll enjoy it when you get there. She has two stories that jumped out at me because one actually has a character called George Eliot in it, and another has a character named Septimus Smith. Referencing, I think she must be referencing Wolfe Stalloway. And then Beth Casaubon, that Casaubon last name also reminds you of Eliot. So I often wonder if she's kind of playing at writing herself into this longer tradition of British fiction, but then always kind of refusing to play that game, kind of suggesting to you that that's what she's going to do. But then, none of her characters give you the kind of, the momentousness of the interwar period, right? In View of the Harbor, we get this kind of seedy post-World War II fishing town where people are looking for drama, but no drama ever happens. Or Angel, who we meet in the last year of Queen Victoria's reign, wants to be a kind of mid-19th century decadent author, but her time has passed. So there's always this kind of sense that I get of belatedness in Taylor's novels. Like it feels like she's coming to the scene of British writing, like she feels like she's coming to the scene of British writing a little bit late. And I wonder what you guys think about that feeling of lateness in her novels, or maybe just how do we place her as a novelist?
I like that. It's what on or about whatever the date is in 1909, 1911, something changed.
1910, it's right in the middle, but yeah.
1910. She's born in 1912.
Yeah.
So she will feel sort of after, as we say, after the Lord Mayor's ball, that the glory things have ended. And it's one thinks of it as being such a sort of drab little period. 50s, 60s, 70s. And then, the kind of novelist she wants to be. The novelist whose novels are principally taken out of public libraries and read by people her age or older and put back. In the way that she describes in Mrs. Palfrey, when the arthritic lady gets other ladies to go to do her library errands for her, and they come back with the wrong books. But I think there are only the wrong books in the 50s and 60s and 70s. She's. I think Elizabeth Taylor is really. Unlike Gwendolyn, I came across her maybe 5 years ago with the view from the Harbour, the View of the Harbour, View from the Harbour, and I've read 4 or 5 of them, and I've read her last posthumous one as well now, called Blaming, part of my preparation homework. And I think she the books are all so different, but I think she makes more and more with less and less. And I really like, it almost is a sort of fast setup. There's just one set, and people sort of walk in and out, and nothing very much happens. And the way that everything happens twice, even, because there's so little of it. Two trips to the library, to the party and the thing with Mrs. de Salis. And it's like something in orbit. It's orbiting orbiting an institution and trying not to be drawn into it, because then you'll be smashed to pieces. So trying to maintain your sort of orbital distance, your independence, something like that, and also try to arrange something with your grandson, and that's your last hope, your last shimmer of life.
Gwendolyn, who do you read her with? Like when you think about who Elizabeth Taylor's contemporaries or her, maybe even her immediate antecedents are, where do you place her?
Gosh, that is so difficult. I mean, I suppose part of the reason why having just sort of tried to read the biography, as I was saying, and having to sort of squint to get the information, because it was a bit of a muddled book, but you can see she was, the legend about her is that she sort of kept herself away from the literary scene. She would occasionally brave a party if Barbara Pym came with her, apparently. But the idea that she's often mentioned in a bracket with Barbara Pym as someone who's a bit neglected, and people keep trying to push her out of that region. She doesn't seem that neglected to me. I mean, she died a rich lady from her writing, and they're still in print, and most writers at least, and plenty of readers like her 50 years on. At the time, of course, you think she was more in that lending library group. She wasn't a sort of high intellectual she wasn't Iris Murdoch, Muriel Spark regions. She wasn't the very fashionable working class writer or writer of working class life. So I'm not sure who she would be like. I want to say Joe Orton or somebody, just for the slightly sordid aspects, but I wonder.
I like no,
Go on.
No, go ahead. You were
I think my thoughts are running out. Yeah, no, I don't know.
I can ask what both of you mentioned libraries, which always also appear in Taylor's novels, and there's a particularly funny description of the library in A View of the Harbor that I just want to read and to get your thoughts on, because it also explicitly uses a word, Michael, that you just used too, which is an institution, and what it might mean as a reader to try to orbit above institutions without being drawn into them, and similarly what it might mean to be a writer that does something similar. So this is early in the novel when Lily is entering the library, and Taylor writes, "The library was part of the institute. Behind a counter was an old man with an ink pad and a large oval stamp, with which he conducted a passionate, erratic campaign against slack morals. His censorship was quite personal. Some books he could not read, and they remained on the shelves in original bindings and without the necessary stigma for adults only. Roderick Random stood thus neglected, and Tristram Shandy, vaguely supposed to be children's books. Jane Eyre, bound and rebound, full of loose leaves, black with grease, fish smelling, was stamped back and forth. Madame Bovary had fallen to pieces. The librarian who performed this useful service to readers had certain fixed standards before him as he sat there skimming through the pages, one hand fingering the rubber stamp. Murder he allowed, but not fornication. Childbirth, especially if the character died of it, but not pregnancy. Love might be supposed to be consummated as long as no one had any pleasure from it." And I love that kind of wicked description of the librarian, who we can tell is kind of lascivious himself from the way he's fingering that rubber stamp, trying to police other people's morals in their reading materials. And Michael, it takes me back to the section from your introduction that you read about what it is that readers want and what it is that Taylor gives readers. What do you think it is that she offers readers, if not the relatable, if not moral didacticism? What is it that makes her unique for both of you?
I must say, I mean, I'd like, especially at a distance, because I've been orbiting England myself in this slightly sort of full-on way for the past few years, and I haven't been to England for a good few years now. I like Gwendolyn's idea of the the naughtiness, the humor. It's not as, I mean, my reading, it's not. It's more to do with inflicting pain than smut or anything like quite like that. But there's I mean, the England that's left with sort of marginal sadism.
Mm. Wait, can you say more about that? I'm not sure I know what that.
Yeah, I can try. I
I would
I've
like
just
to understand this. I would like to understand.
Yes, I've just got there. I mean, you can probably do it too, or you could walk it on. I mean, I think it's you know, the way that she isn't. I mean, I think one of my favorite books is Virginia Woolf's last novel, Between the Acts, which I think is a kind of really sort of oddly, sort of unexpectedly, completely benign book. And there's always something sort of malicious, mildly poisonous, mildly disagreeable about Elizabeth Taylor that I must say I really like. I mean, I love Between the Acts, but and I also sort of, to me also sort of, this is a, you know, it's kind of personal thing, but to me she's also sort of showing England becoming receptive to Europe. This is, you know, a year or two before Ted Heath took England into the common market. And you know, you start getting foreign restaurants, and you start getting foreign names, and the sense that London is becoming, I mean, the word hadn't been thought of then, but it's becoming a kind of cosmopolitan place in some way. I mean, maybe the first Australians had started going to London or something like that. No? And I mean, this book after this book, Blaming, actually has you know, begins on a cruise, and the Englishman, and some of the stories I think take you out of England as well. But it's a sort of new thing for an English novelist to do abroad, or to see, or to find England, the Hampstead novel, to find that no longer enough, and to just to walk you into the sort of the European mainland.
I mean, I haven't read Blaming, and I'm eager to, but one of the reasons I read that passage with the librarian is because I read a review a while ago that described Taylor as a profoundly moral novelist, not a didactic one, but someone who is interested in using the novel to make people think about questions of cruelty, of responsibility, of sympathy. And that, just the title of the last novel, Blaming, that's such a word that brings all of those concerns into alignment with one another. So that's why the scene with the librarian sort of fascinates me. Gwendolyn, what makes her unique for you, or what is it that draws you to her?
Something in what you were just talking about, maybe there's often a character in her book who's a sort of a lame duck and is not going to ever quite find their place, and they end up dead. It happens in Blaming. It happens in is it called A Summer Season? In a Summer Season as well. And that's, and in Blaming particularly, you're left with this awful backwash of regret at the ending for what's happened. I was thinking in that line of sort of Henry Green type titles, it could have been called Wincing, Cringing, Flinching, Frowning. I think I like that quality of the sort of English frown that goes through all the characters, frowning in intent or worry or pain, that kind of thing. I mean, the slight balminess of the characters too. Apparently she didn't like Dickens at all, but there's something Dickensian in the sort of character comedy, this sort of idée fixe that they have, these people. So I love that. I also love that, you know, the painterliness we haven't said as much about, but she often has painter characters, and it's just something simple like the weather descriptions. They're so perfect. In Angel, they're very like Atkinson Grimshaw paintings. There's a lot of blurred lamplight and greasy cobbles and smog. And then a view of the harbour. We've got the sort of more watercolory descriptions. I like all that. bit more basic. What else? Yeah, no, that'll do. But I think what you were saying there, that feeling of cruelty, definitely, and the characters who don't survive, the people who survive, who are either widowed, end up marrying each other, but then there's always someone who's come to a bad end, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I was also just thinking of I mean, I hope I won't ruin it for anyone if I give away the final line of Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont, which is that after Mrs. Palfrey dies, her relations do not think to submit an obituary to the deaths column of the Daily Telegraph. And the final line is, Elizabeth, her daughter, Elizabeth and Ian had decided that there was no one left who would be interested. And that's another kind of question that the novels raise, right? Is they range before us these characters in whom pretty much everyone else has ceased to be interested, whether it's the aged or whether it's the inhabitants of the seaside town and A View from the Harbor, or at the end of Angel living in the kind of decaying paradise house, right? And I think that one of the great gifts that she has is to make us interested in characters who do not command anyone else's interest. And that seems to me a kind of moral enterprise, to say, look at these wasted lives, look at this wasted potential, and try to see something in that, and keep trying to see something in that.
Absolutely. I mean, the question is, what will such a life have been? And that future perfect is really her tense. What will I have been? What will he, she, it, they have been? What will they have amounted to? What is left of them? And that to me is also the I would call it the Englische Frage, the English question. What is left? And maybe that's. I do think she's more spiteful probably than Chekhov, who I think is who I can't imagine that any bad thing being said of. But there's there's a hat pin, little hat pin to stick to people.
There's a good question in the chat that I want to ask from Liam Kruger, who says, if we're historicizing Taylor in terms of Britain's entry into the common market as runoff from Britain's not so much declining as declined imperial hegemony, what do we make of NYRB reprinting her novels in the run-up to and wake of Brexit as runoff from a different hegemonic shift, maybe? Yeah, so why? I guess another way of asking the question is, would it be right to say that there's a kind of renewed interest in Taylor now? And if so, Michael, would that maybe agitate against your point in the introduction about relatability? Is there actually something oddly and newly relatable about her?
Yeah, no, I think we all operate with the idea of copyright somewhere, sort of unconsciously at our back, and so the Second World War has become public property. We've now passed the Second World War, and we're now interested in the 50s because that's now 70 years ago. And I think beyond that, in Taylor, there are sort of big, really surprisingly big sentences. Like I think Mrs. Post is splashed by a lorry quite early on, and she says, "England's manners." And there's a conversation sort of later on in the book about Gold Cup Day. This is the English and their horse sports. So the Gold Cup Day and the Queen and all the having horses and so on. England at its best. So there's almost a sort of conscious. I mean, there is the an England card which is played, and it's not one can no longer call it unconscious. As for I mean, it makes the likes of me feel nostalgic because this is the moment when England is beginning to crumble and joining the Montana Union and the common market. And England is there is color, the whole sort of black and white, the whole sort of the whole Ted Hughes, any color as long as it's gray, all of that is sort of ending, and there is color and there is music and there are English young people, and it isn't sort of post-war, and it's not rationing anymore. I mean, it is a moment of sort of opening, although it's typically Taylor has it registered by people who are past that age and who to whom it's actually unwelcome. But for what it's worth, it is happening, and I would like to think that people might read these books and think, we didn't know we had it so good.
Gwendolyn, what about you? Do you have thoughts about the contemporaneous reissuing of these books and whether they're tuned to a kind of post-Brexit state of the nation?
Oh, well, of course, over here they never went out of print. Although they're over here, they're in books by Virago that are sort of packaged. They look like scented soaps. They're very strange covers. I was thinking actually in the
Virago cover, yeah.
Oh no, yeah, with the Jilly Cooper quote on the front. There's a scene in the book where Mrs. Palfrey notices that all the young people are going around with plastic bags with Union Jacks on them, and she can't work out whether this is a good or a bad thing. She doesn't know what to make of it. And that's certainly something that's sort of gone on from Liam Gallagher's guitar and Posh Spicer's dress and Morrissey at Live Anyway, the Union Jack thing. What else? I can't talk about hegemonic anything. Sorry. But that's what I thought.
Well, I mean, I'm struck by the Mr. Osmond character. I mean, I think all of my dog-eared pages actually are about Mr. Osmond talking about providing medical care to foreigners, and Mr. Osmond talking about how they deliberately seek out these foreign weather forecasters in order to deaden the effects of the comprehensive schools. And there is this eerie way in which his voice seems to echo before its time, a kind of xenophobic, nationalistic sentiment. And so I do think it's interesting that NYRB chose to reissue Mrs. Palfrey at this moment, as opposed to one of the earlier novels. I mean, Michael, did that affect at all your decision to want to write the introduction to this particular?
Oh, but totally. I mean, it's the one I was kindly offered, and I mean, I can remember. I'm the only person here who can remember 1971, it is extraordinary how fiction is able to record epoch or era or style. I mean, that things, and you think you're watching. I mean, I'm not that interested in the story, in the farce and the movements of characters and so on, but I'm completely fascinated by the background, and I'm really struck by how much, almost by inadvertence, is there. And as you were saying about this grim Mr. Osborne, I mean that he rules the world.
But there's also something sympathetic about his impotence, right? I mean, for those who haven't read the novel, he takes Mrs. Palfrey out for an evening, and he has this sort of awful proposal of marriage, which is, I mean, it's painful to read that. It's painful to read that. And I think you're right that she, there are all of these pinpricks, that she can be a kind of spiteful novelist. But I also think that there are these kind of moments where a surprising sympathy wells up for characters you would never expect. And maybe that's just through their humiliation, but yeah.
Also,
sorry, go on, Dylan.
I was just about to say that Mr. Osmond's vision of married life is a tiny bit European, at least in that it's a wine and cheese evening. It's not just sort of Abigail's party, cheesy pineapples. It's a nice bit of cheese and some red wine. So that little bit of foreign glamour has ensorcelled him as well, even for all his annoyance at the accents on the radio.
But it says near the beginning that he doesn't like female company and seldom got any other kind. And I think that's lovely. And this is a man who is supposed to who is making going down on bended knee to Mrs. Palfrey, or not.
Well, it's also just to think about what we were talking about a little bit earlier, the kinds of plots or the kinds of scenarios that one doesn't think are open or available to characters of a certain age, right? It's interesting that the way that drama gets interjected into a novel where, I mean, you don't see it coming, do you? I mean, I was thinking a little bit about other novels that are interested in aging and that have characters that are not in their 50s or 60s, but really in their 80s or 90s. And another great NYRB reissue that I was thinking about was Leonora Carrington's The Hearing Trumpet, which I don't know if either of you have read, but it's a sort of madcap surrealist novel, also takes place at an institute, but it turns into a kind of grail quest. Really kind of goes off the ropes. But what are other novels that you guys admire or that you think are preoccupied with similar sorts of questions about what drama can unfold or how one measures one's life toward the end of it?
I can't remember.
Sorry to put you on the spot. I'm just always struck by how many of our novels are Bildungsroman, right? They have young people or they're kind of midlife crisis. They're midlife crisis novels. But it's surprisingly hard to think of novels that have characters in their 80s or 90s in them. Yeah.
Can you remember the name of? I mean, another NYRB classics, but I mean the Guernsey novel, the one about the old man. I loved it when it came out. I wrote about it when it came out. Titles leave me.
Okay, if anyone in our audience remembers the name of the Guernsey novel,
I've got it. Wait there, I've got that novel.
It's the only way of.
Oh, Ebenezer
Lepage. Well done, thank you.
Yes.
You read it.
Thank you, Sarah Kramer, and Gwendolyn, who pulled it off of her shelf. Okay, so Ebenezer Lepage, another great novel.
I mean, it's a sort of solitary. But that's a sort of solitary age. I mean, I think this sort of courtship proposal thing is in this novel what the car crash is in other novels. I mean, it's the catastrophe.
Right.
You know, it's where it takes one or two characters out of the action.
Gwendolyn, are there other novels with characters in their 80s or 90s that occur to you? No.
not on the tip of my tongue. If my eyes go, it's because I'm trying to scan my bookshelves in the dark from a distance, and I cannot. Nothing's coming immediately to mind.
Yeah.
Governor, Time of Cholera, something like that. Are they old?
Are they old? All right, I'm going to turn to the
Paul Bailey's first novel. Isn't that about people in an old people's home?
Well, that is
Yes.
supposedly Ludo.
So it is. There we go. So
Yes,
it's
he wrote the
it's come full
introduction
circle.
to the Virago.
He's the real.
Yeah,
He's the
and
real. The real.
he's the real Ludo. He's the real Ludo, which might give us a hint as to whether Ludo is supposed to be a good novelist or not.
It's called At the Jerusalem, is it not? That book.
That's right. You're right. Yeah. I mean, because he's the hero, he's the central figure. So I had to write about the background.
Right.
So
No, I
I'm
think
saying.
Yeah, so well, I just want to say, first of all, thank you three for this great conversation and the audience for these wonderful questions so far. Let's keep them coming while we have another 10 minutes or so. So since we're on the subject of Ludo, that's where we left off. There's a good question here from an anonymous attendee with respect to Taylor's generic ambivalence. Are these novelists good or bad? That question. And by extension, is this novel a good version of those bad novels or more of the same? And the anonymous attendee mentions the casting of Rupert Friend as Ludo in the otherwise not so great 2005 film as being one good thing. I don't know if y'all have an answer to that question, whether these are good versions of bad novels or anything to say about the 2005 film, perhaps.
I
haven't seen any of the films.
Yeah, I haven't seen the 2005 film, but I mean, I'll just maybe, I apologize if this is repeating something that I said earlier, but one of the reasons I think that the characters, the novelist characters are in so many of her novels is to authorize her to change her style from novel to novel, such that Angel is filled with these much more Baroque descriptions of these Baroque fantastical descriptions of houses and landscapes and settings. And that's in part because that's the kind of writing that Angel does, right? She writes these fantastical novels such that in the beginning of the novel, her teacher is looking up lines from Walter Pater to see if she's plagiarizing from him, right? And so I kind of think that that's the function that the novelists serve, is not necessarily to be the bad novelist to Taylor's much better novelist, but to actually allow Taylor to kind of modulate her style as she moves from one novel to another, and to kind of modulate the thematics or the subjects of her novels too. But now I'm going to go watch the movie.
Yeah, I think that's what we're all going to do after we log off tonight. Watch the 2005 film that we're told is not very great. That's wonderful. Charles Oberndorf, excuse me, says Michael's mention of hat pins makes them think of Penelope Fitzgerald. And they're wondering if there's any overlap in worldview between those two novelists. We talked a little about other contemporaries, so maybe that's another one if you'd like to address Penelope Fitzgerald. I'm also curious if you could identify maybe some influences and inheritors to Elizabeth Taylor's legacy.
Probably very interesting, but slightly interesting. After she left school, Elizabeth Taylor was a governess for a while, and one little boy she looked after was Penelope Fitzgerald's nephew, Oliver Knox. Interesting, not trivia is the word. Anyway, that's my contribution to that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think Penelope Fitzgerald too, and that at the end of her career, her last 3 books also left the island. I mean, a book in Russia, a book in Italy, a book in Germany, and it was as though she too had sort of spiraled out of England and was looking for the wider scene.
Well, thank you for that.
But she had I think she always had a much more established reputation and probably a better class of readership or something.
We have another question from anonymous attendee who is hoping that Gwendolyn, maybe you could expand on your characterization of the novel as sordid. They're hoping for a little elaboration on that.
Sordid might have been overdoing it. I was thinking about, when Mr. Osmond is trying to bond with the very rare men that he encounters, he often does this through, maybe coarse would be a better word. These little anecdotes he tries to tell people, and they're, at one point he's crying out, he's shouting out enormous sex organ in the ear of this waiter. That's so that was an example. That's not. I mean, Jane Austen wouldn't have had that, for instance. Sordid. I don't know. I mean, there's a scene where Ludo is in Harrod's writing down descriptions of all the people he sees. I've got it in front of me, and he's sort of going through hammer toes, fallen arches, pursed lips, parched lips, eye teeth, dog teeth, book teeth. It reminded me of Philip Larkin's poem Marriages, where he says, add-a-faced singularity, skin disease, pardons, soft horror of living, this kind of thing. Anyway, just this list of afflictions. And I think there's little bursts of that, which are quite sort of, burr making, I think, but sordid was probably the wrong word, but it's to think of it as a comedy of manners is wrong, because there's these weird bursts. I think that's very English as well. We're all cramped in, but then we burst out with things like that. Not me personally.
I don't think sordid was the wrong word. And I think that the moments that feel sordid to me in the novel are these very odd moments of transaction. So when Rosie, Ludo's love interest, for instance, goes out with him because he promises to pay for Chinese food and she's hungry, right? There's something sordid about the transactional nature of that relationship. Or when Ludo asks Mrs. Palfrey for a loan for his mother, there's something sordid in that moment too. And I guess to me, it feels like the sordid moments in the novel have something to do with people asking for things in a way that overstep what their relations to other people might be. And sort of knowing that the people they ask can't be able to or won't be able to say no. There's something kind of extractive in some of the relationships that are set up in this novel that feel difficult to look at or to see clearly.
I mean, there's no money really in the book, and Mrs. Palfrey's watchword is, she repeats to herself, "Don't touch capital, don't touch capital," and those moments kind of violate that prohibition. If she has to give £50, that's capital. She can't expect to ever see that again.
Yeah.
So sordid is the right word. I think that we decided.
I think
sordid is carried.
Should stick with. I think Gwendolyn should stick with sordid. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we only have a minute or two left, so I'm hoping maybe just last thoughts, if you have anything else to offer, any of the three of you, before we sign off for the night.
I think she's a wonderful sort of discovery. I mean, to me, in my world, in my out of range of Virago books, she wasn't a name, and she was always the other Elizabeth Taylor. And now Elizabeth Taylor becomes contested ground.
I just want my new edition. I keep being told it's on its way, Michael, but I don't know. I'm not sure.
I hope.
So I'm just
I hope. I mean, I do like the glass here. Yeah, I mean, it's the only one I've seen, but it's I'm probably keeping it.
Yeah, that glass is neither half empty nor half full. It just looks completely transparent.
Well, then it's empty. Then it's bone dry.
Yeah, it's bone dry.
Well, thank you all so much for this really wonderful conversation. This was a pleasure. Those of you at home, please consider purchasing a copy of Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont from Community Bookstore. We hope to see you at another virtual event soon. Maybe your copy will get there before Merveille's. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great evening, everyone.
So, thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.